Hello and welcome to Eyes on Research, the podcast that digests the latest scientific innovations in eye research using simple and understandable terms. I am your host, Thales Guimarães, medical doctor and clinician scientist at Moorfields Eye Hospital. Hello and welcome to another episode of Eyes on Research. I hope you have been healthy and that the week has been treating you well so far. In today's episode, we'll be talking about caffeine and your visual health. We'll first discuss the pharmacologic effects that caffeine has in the body, and then we'll talk about its possible associations in the eye. For a bit of background, caffeine is the most widely consumed central nervous system stimulant worldwide, with some estimatives saying that more than 80% of the population contain a certain type of meal or drink that has caffeine in its formula. More than 50 different species of plants, including tea leaves and even cocoa beans, naturally contain it in varying degrees, with the main dietary source, of course, being roasted coffee beans. However, there have been a few possible associations of caffeine, of coffee consumption, and our eyes, our vision in some research studies. And if you're like me and you love your morning dose of coffee, in fact, there's barely a day I can get by without my coffee in the morning. Uh, the question that we will respond is, can caffeine affect my eyesight in any way? And to analyze this, we first need to talk about the effects of caffeine in the body as a whole. I guess just to make this clear, when we talk about pharmacological activity of a certain substance, regardless of which substance it is, we are talking about the way that it interacts with proteins, enzymes, receptors, and our own DNA. And what exactly is the effect of caffeine in the body? The mechanism of action of the caffeine follows a few different pathways. And this has been studied for a long time now, so some of these are very clear. Firstly, it acts as an antagonist of adenosine by limiting adenosine binding with its receptors. This results in temporary relief of drowsiness, which is why, you guessed, we feel more alert when we consume caffeine. The second mechanism is by inhibition of phosphodiesterase activity, leading to the accumulation of cyclic AMP, which means adenosine monophosphate. This is a messenger that carries crucial information for various tissues in the body for various essential functions of the cells. One of those is stimulating lipolysis, right? Which is the breakdown of fatty tissue or lipids, which has both detrimental and desirable effects. The third mechanism is by the release of calcium when exposed to higher concentrations of caffeine. In fact, caffeine, when in very high concentrations, can activate calcium channels found within the cells, causing the release of the calcium that was previously stored on them. It may result in an increase in the strength and endurance of muscles, including in the heart. There are also other mechanisms being investigated, but currently these are the main known mechanisms to which it stimulates our central nervous system. Now, it also has some effects in other parts of the body, in tissues that are outside the brain. For instance, caffeine has what we call a positive chronotropic effect, which essentially means that it increases the heart rate by blocking adenosine receptors in the heart. It can also cause the release of dopamine and norepinephrine, which increases the blood pressure. And in a similar topic, caffeine is also a diuretic, or in other words, it increases the amounts of the urine output of a person. which may lead to dehydration. These are just some of its effects and is by no means an exhaustive list. With that in mind, these effects are not all bad, right? In fact, there are several studies linking coffee consumption with an increased concentration, cognition, and weight loss, right? Well, that's all great, and so you may say, but what does the science have to say about how it affects the vision? Many studies have been analyzing the role of caffeine in our vision. So it's impossible to go through all of the research studies. I will try to summarize a selected body containing the strongest evidence so far. Let's start with glaucoma. There's some evidence linking caffeine consumption with increased risk for glaucoma. A study from 2012 revealed a link between high coffee consumption and higher risk of developing glaucoma. This risk was strongest and more relevant in women with a positive family history. So, when there was a family member already affected with glaucoma. Afterwards, in 2020, a South Korean study found a risk between caffeine consumption and risk of glaucoma in men, but not in women this time. Another study published 1 year later in 2021 in the journal Ophthalmology analyzed the association between coffee, intraocular pressure, and glaucoma. And very interesting, the results did not support a causal effect of coffee drinking on intraocular pressure. Similarly, the relationship between caffeine intake and glaucoma was null, meaning that there was no apparent significant association between them. However, in the subjects that again had the strongest genetic predisposition to elevated intraocular pressure, higher caffeine intakes was associated with both higher intraocular pressure and higher glaucoma prevalence. So there seems to be some sort of genetic influence to the developing a higher intraocular pressure and developing glaucoma in patients who drink coffee. That's the first thing to say here. Then another study also published in the journal Ophthalmology in 2022, which is 1 year later, looked at more than 120,000 individuals from European descent. The researchers found again genetic evidence that higher coffee consumption is associated with a higher risk of primary open angle glaucoma, which is the most common type of glaucoma. Now let's move on to another very common disease in the eye. Let's talk about diabetes, right? Multisystemic disease affecting various systems in the body. Diabetes can affect the retina, just for full clarity, by causing something that we name diabetic retinopathy. And this is because of the microvascular abnormalities that patients with diabetes have. And this can cause permanent vision loss if not recognized and adequately treated, and if the diabetes is not controlled. Another Korean study tried to correlate this time coffee consumption and diabetic retinopathy. The prevalence of diabetic retinopathy and particularly vision threatening diabetic retinopathy had a significantly decreasing trend according to daily coffee consumption. This trend was more pronounced in those aged less than 65 years old, and this was after adjusting for all of the other confounder factors, such as age, body mass index, physical activity, and hypertension. The translation of this is essentially that the evidence from the study suggests that coffee consumption may be associated with the reduction in the prevalence of or in the risk of diabetic retinopathy, particularly in individuals with diabetes aged less than 65 years, in Koreans at least, which is quite interesting, right? Seems that there's a protective factor there. And what about cataracts? Cataracts are a degeneration of the crystalline lens, which is this lens that we have inside our eyes that focuses the rays of light onto the retina. And we have an episode on refractive errors where we talk about a little bit about the anatomy of the eye and how the lens work. So do check it out. It was just released last week. And what happens is that, the lens opacifies with time. And this will happen with all of us with age. We call this age-related cataracts. I study published in the journal Nutrients, that's the name of the journal, in 2020, try to assess the correlation between lifestyle and the prevalence of age-related cataracts. And it did this by looking at the prevalence of things like high blood pressure, high blood glucose, diet, and the intake of sodium. They analyzed the correlation between the diet and the polygenetic risk scores, which are essentially intended to reflect the genetic influence on the risk of developing age-related cataracts. So essentially, they are considering external factors, environmental factors like a diet, and then factors which are genetic, so intrinsic in our own blueprint, right? Interestingly, they found a few things, but specifically related to coffee, the data suggested that a higher coffee consumption was associated with reduced prevalence of age-related cataracts. How cool is that? Then we also have a lot of research focused in dry eye disease and age-related macular degeneration. Think about all the diseases that we're talking about here: diabetic retinopathy, age-related macular degeneration, cataracts, dry eye disease, glaucoma. These are very common diseases, right? So let's talk about these two separately. And just a bit of self-promotion again. We have episodes on these two specific diseases: dry eye disease and age-related macular degeneration. So feel free to check it out if that's something that interests you. But starting about dry eyes, right? First, I studied published in the journal Cornea, that's the name of the journal, last year in 2023, found a link between higher caffeine intake and marginally lower risk of dry eye disease. And this link disappeared when the data was adjusting for pre-existing healthy conditions. The authors then concluded that the dietary caffeine intake, of course with moderation, did not seem to be a risk factor for dry eye disease in the general population. Essentially, there seems to be absolutely no correlation in a study which was strong like this. No correlation was found between caffeine intake and the development of dry eye disease. Let's fast forward to age-related macular degeneration, which is the most common cause of irreversible vision loss in the elderly. In fact, it's estimated to affect almost 300 million people by 2040. That's a lot of people. Well, there have been also a few studies trying to analyze the association between, dietary patterns, including coffee consumption, and this disease, age-related macular degeneration. Let's talk about two studies. The first one was back in 2001. The authors tried to correlate caffeine consumption with the 5-year incidence of early age-related macular degeneration, to which it found absolutely no association. Similarly, another study published in 2017 that used logistic regression, which is a statistic to look for trends, tried to correlate dietary patterns with the prevalence of the disease. And this study found interesting associations, several potential beneficial and harmful foods, right? That may be a risk or may be beneficial, may be protective in the development of age-related macular degeneration. And amongst the potentially beneficial foods, we found out that peanuts, pizza, coffee, and tea were likely to be beneficial, with salad dressing being harmful. Of course, This is a study analyzing trends, right? So it's not very specific. But as soon as I read the first time a few years ago, I as other sons should do, I called my mom immediately and I told her, "Hey, mom, pizza is healthy. I told you so." This is not exactly how this translates to, of course, but I could not lose the joke. But jokes aside, another study published a little bit more recently in 2023 also provided evidence suggesting that both coffee and tea consumptions had likely protective effects in the neurons, right? Which is what we call neuroprotective. And by the way, neurons are not a tissue that regenerates. So there's a lot of studies trying to find possible drugs that have a neuroprotective factor. It's a huge field of drug development right now. Another study published 1 year previously to that, 2022, found that caffeine could also potentially suppress the inflammatory responses that causes age-related macular degeneration to happen. If it does indeed suppress inflammatory responses, this is huge. And it may be share the same pathway to which caffeine may be a protective factor in the development of diabetic retinopathy, right? Because remember, inflammation and microvascular abnormalities in diabetes have a huge contribution to the development of diabetic retinopathy as well. So maybe it's acting in a common pathway. How cool is that? So, in summary, there's evidence that coffee may be protective for some diseases, and evidence that it may not have any influence whatsoever in the development of other diseases. Albeit it may be a risk factor in the development of glaucoma, particularly when there is a genetic history as well, or a heavy genetic predisposition. It is very hard to generalize, and it's probably wiser to go in a case by case scenario. But one thing I would say for all of us is that life goes much better when everything is in moderation. So you never hear me telling a patient to stop drinking coffee, but you always hear me asking the patients to drink coffee in moderation. Thank you so much for listening to me today. I hope you found this episode useful. I should also say that we have social media accounts where we post short videos about teams that did not go on to become a full episode. So visit us on at Eyes on Research on your favorite social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. We have it all, so go look for us. Also, you'll find the link in the description of this episode to our Buy Me a Coffee website, which is our support page, and we also use this website to post articles. Please consider subscribing to us there. It's completely free, and we are using that platform as a blog. So you see weekly posts about curiosities and trivia about the eyes and vision, as well as hot research updates on topics that did not go on to become a full episode. So please do consider subscribing. And in this page, you also have the possibility to support us. That will give you access to some perks, cool things like suggesting themes for blog articles, short videos, or even full podcast episodes. Otherwise, I should thank you very much and have a wonderful rest of the week. And I hopefully will see you next week, next Wednesday, for our next episode. Have a safe week. Bye bye.